Zach Cregger, to date, has only made 2 horror films, and yet many would include him among the greatest directors working in the genre right now, myself included. I was a fan of Barbarian, with its fantastic handle on suspense and its surprising and unorthodox narrative structure, but I also found that same structure that made it so unique made the movie feel somewhat disjointed and clunky in some ways. The first half of the film continues to be my favorite part, and I'm always a little let down when the tonal shifts start coming into play. So going into Weapons, I was wondering if I was going to have a similar experience. Weapons is a horror fairy tale of sorts, taking place in a small town where in the middle of the night, 17 children got up out of bed and ran out into the darkness, vanishing in utter mystery, and what follows is the film treating us to 6 vignettes of different people in the town who either are or become involved with this strange mystery, be it directly or through some unfortunate circumstances. In many ways, Weapons does indeed make use of some of the same non-linear narrative structure that made Barbarian both really unique and also kind of messy. But what makes this movie so special is that although these comparisons can be drawn, Weapons manages to avoid even the slightest hint of the clunkiness that at least I felt in the first film. That's not to say that the movie is just a smoother take on the narrative structure present in Barbarian. It's so much more than that. For me, it's the movie that really solidified Cregger as one of the best names working in horror at the moment, and just recently, it won an Oscar. Amy Madigan won Best Supporting Actress, which was so cool to see and so well deserved. That was kind of like an iconic night for horror. We had Weapons and Sinners and Frankenstein just killing it. That was amazing. Now, I originally filmed this video back in December, and then I had to delay it because I saw Dead Meat was getting like copyright strikes on theirs, so I got nervous, and now I'm trying again, so let's see what we can make work here. Just before we start this video is not sponsored. I just wanted to mention that I've started making exclusive videos for YouTube channel members and Patreon supporters, where I'm basically doing like first impression, short spoiler-free reviews. I did it recently for Undertone. I'm planning on doing it for a couple movies coming up, and I'm definitely planning on doing some more bonus content for channel members and Patreon supporters. So if that's something you're interested in, check that out. Weapons is told in 6 chapters, divided up by the character which each chapter focuses on. They intertwine and intersect throughout, but they're also these really great contained short films in and of themselves that avoid feeling disconnected or dissonant. Let's talk some more technical stuff first, and then we can really dive into the film's narrative. Barbarian was also a really well shot and directed film, but honestly, Weapons is just straight up better in that right. It feels super refined and well thought out, with some sequences being filmed in ways that makes this movie really stand out without ever feeling like it's being overly flashy and trying to compensate for an anemic story with distracting visuals. I will say that if you're watching this movie on its 4K Blu-ray release and you're making use of the Dolby Vision, then for all that's holy, you need to watch this in a dark room, because this is a dark transfer. I'm probably gonna brighten these scenes in post while I'm editing the video, but I mean, this is really dark. I've said this many times, but just a word of warning, if you're watching this in Dolby Vision, you really need to do it in the right environment. That being said, in the ideal context, the nighttime scenes in this movie look absolutely fantastic. There's a super cold and eerie look to them, and it makes sequences like when James is in Alex's house for the first time genuinely intense, because it feels like anything could be hiding anywhere in frame and you may not notice it. The shift in Alex's house from the flashbacks we have of him with his parents, where it feels warm and homely, to when Glattis arrives and takes over, draining all the life from the house and leaving it feeling like some dug-up relic found frozen in a glacier, this kind of thing is used to great effect. Most of the movie is on the cooler side, save for some of the scenes in the room that Glattis claims towards the end of the movie, which has an amazing effect on that part of the story. I love the look and feel of Weapons, but it would be a disservice to not also throw a bunch of praise at the team behind the music. I say team because it wasn't one person doing the music here. Hayes Holiday, Ryan Holiday, and even Zach Cregger himself are all credited for the soundtrack to Weapons, which is super cool to see him that involved with his films. The score, for the most part, is pretty understated, but it's still pretty damn brilliant because of how well it accentuates the different tones of the movie. What's so great about this is that it feels like the movie is right in the middle of something that, if it were to lean a little more in either direction, would be really effective horror music or really effective music for something a little sillier, for example. But outside of scenes that fully commit to one tone or another, they ride that line right in the middle in a way that really helps to avoid causing any tonal clashing in the soundscape. It also makes it so that when they do want to lean in a certain direction more aggressively, it avoids feeling jarring because we've already had something that's sort of giving you that flavor already. It's a really effective score, and for me the easy highlight comes during Alex's chapter, which is the darkest part of the film and introduces some fantastic dark synth stuff for the really disturbing shit going on with Glattis. And then we also have an absolute ripper during the scene where she calls the children into the house for the first time. The score there just adds so much weight to the horror of what's going on, and they also did a perfect job of pulling from the really tragic storyline of Alex's parents and the thematic relevance behind that plot point. Weapons has a phenomenal aesthetic from all angles, with some really fun and creative visuals, and a score that feels unique and powerful in a way that fits the story perfectly. One more thing I want to talk about before we dive into the story is how the movie handles its scares, because again, with Weapons being something that you could easily call a horror comedy, it can sometimes be difficult to make scares land properly when they're surrounded by humor on all sides. But they avoid that completely here. Now, I'm not saying the movie's like terrifying or anything like that, but it absolutely has its moments where it delivers on some extremely effective scares. The most chilling section of the film, without a doubt, is Alex's chapter as Glattis takes over his home, but a lot of that is more of an emotional and tonal thing, so well, let's save that for a bit later. Granted, that moment of Glattis getting Alex's parents to just go at their own faces with forks is pretty goddamn disturbing in its own right. Glattis is a wild-looking character, and there are a number of moments, particularly before we've properly met her and gotten to actually acquaint ourselves with what she looks like, where that design results in some very creepy visuals. That scare of Justine seeing her on the ceiling is great, and I love the one in Archer's dream where he's trying to tell his son that he loves him as he feels like he doesn't say it enough, and it suddenly turns into Glattis, which is a great moment because it's an effective scare that's then followed up directly with a great comedic moment, but it doesn't kill the actual scare because Archer's reaction to what happened feels like a very human response.
What the fuck?
That is the correct reaction. I also love when James sees her in the woods later on, which is just a really creepy scene with her slow motion wave looking so completely out of place, and Alex's face blending with hers is also an unsettling image. Now, the main reason that I'm dedicating an entire section here to talking about the movie's scares is because of one sequence that comes early on. I often find that many of the creepiest visuals almost brush up against the line of something that could look humorous, but because of the context, it doesn't. I'm talking about the scene where Justine is camping outside of Alex's house to try and get some information about what's going on, and his mother comes out doing this creepy-ass unnatural walk, climbs into the back seat of the car, cuts Justine's hair, and just leaves. Let's hold on this for a moment. So, to start off, the thing that I adore about this is precisely what I was just mentioning a moment ago. If you were rehearsing this walk in broad daylight and without the proper framing of the image, this is absolutely something that you could sit there looking at and just go, man, is this gonna look really fucking stupid when we film it? It so easily could be outside of the proper context, but when you build up to it without really having anything happen yet in the film, linger on that silence in the dark night before she starts lumbering out like this, and then we can't get a proper idea of what's going on because there's only shimmers of light hitting her through tree branches and stuff like that, it results in a really chilling moment. It immediately became one of my favorite scares I'd seen in years when I saw this, but it's the way the scene plays out in such an unexpected way that really makes it work so well. It's almost like this one sequence is a sort of microcosm for Zach Cregger's films in general. When it starts, it's just really freaky. Then she gets to the window and it's still unsettling, but it's also kind of funny now. And then she climbs into the back seat and we're right back to it being really freaky. And then we hear the sound of scissors and suddenly every alarm bell is going off as she raises them towards Justine. And then she just cuts her hair and does off with it. And we're left really not having any clue what the fuck to think, because we just went through something that was roller coastering through horror, humor, discomfort, and confusion all within like 30 seconds. It's a fantastic scene and easily my favorite scare sequence of the film. There's nothing in this movie that freaked me out as much as that first descent into the tunnels in Barbarian did, but this is just a really cool sequence from the standpoint of how it's constructed, and hearing Cregger talk about what he'd hoped people would feel during this up and down tone was so much fun because I felt exactly what he described he'd hoped people would feel. Very well done. Alright, moving on to the story, a big reason that these chapters avoid feeling broken up is because while this isn't something that the movie outwardly focuses on heavily, Weapons has many themes surrounding alcoholism, which were inspired by Zach Cregger's own life, and some form of addiction at various stages is present throughout most chapters. We have Justine, who's drinking rather heavily most days and definitely looks to be in the early stages of developing a really serious problem, especially once we see her sneaking liquor into takeout cups. We have Paul, who's a recovering alcoholic, and then there's James, who's a full-blown addict struggling to really get his life going. One of the things that makes Weapons such an effective movie is that it can be enjoyed whether you look at it from the perspective of a thematically rich exploration of addiction and the ways that this impacts not only the people directly dealing with it, but also those around them, using Glattis as a stand-in for alcoholism and other forms of addiction being likened to a foreign presence being introduced into a home and changing everything you know about it and the people around you. Or you can just watch it as a super fun, twisting ride through a wild period of time where a dying witch realized she needed to replenish herself and steal the life force from others and used the home of someone she knew to base that out of. What's even more impressive about how all this is handled is that the movie can also be looked at through that lens of addiction and still be an absolute blast of a horror film that isn't bogged down by its heavy subject matter, despite going pretty dark when it needs to. It's not like you're going to be missing pieces of the story connecting properly if you choose to just have fun with it. And that balance is something that is super tricky to get right. A big reason that Cregger manages to strike that balance as well as he does here is because while he does often have theme in mind when he's writing, he doesn't bind the story to that theme in the same way that something like Midsommar does, for example, where in that movie you can't really avoid seeing it as a story about breakups and vulnerability. That's exactly what Ari Aster was writing about. Not saying that's a bad thing, by the way, but it's just a different way to approach telling the story than what we see here, where that idea of exploring alcoholism and how it impacts the carer dynamics of a home was something that was being thought about a lot, but wasn't used as a strict guideline. These themes are used as jumping off points to get the story moving in a direction, and then if it veers somewhere else, that's totally fine. That core is always there, but it's not demanding every single moment of the film. It's pretty clear at this point that Cregger is a pantser-style writer, which, for those of you who aren't aware, is someone who writes without having much of a plan of where the story is going. This was how he approached Barbarian, and it's also how he went about handling Weapons, which simply started with an idea that, a bunch of kids ran out of their homes in the middle of the night, and a young girl was telling it in a voiceover like a fairy tale. That was all he had when he started this script, and then as you start writing with this approach, you'll slowly find the answers within the motion of writing. Works for some people, not so much for others, but it clearly works for this dude. Now, I'm not someone who typically tries to figure out where a movie is going right from the start. I like to just let it take me on a ride. I don't want to figure out where it's going before it's had a chance to get there. But because I've been writing a lot recently, I do try to ask myself where I would personally take a story were I in the writer's seat. And I did find it rather satisfying that during that opening monologue, I was thinking I'd have this be like a witch that was calling the kids out somewhere. And then that's exactly what wound up happening. That was fun. I think that's important to note because, like I said, I'm not someone who typically figures out where a movie is going ahead of time unless it's painfully obvious, because I like to just turn off that part of my brain while watching something. I want to go on the ride. So if I do clock what's going on early, it may mean that it was just too obvious. However, the reason I'm mentioning all of that is because at its core, Weapons, while not a generic story, is a very simple one, but it's in that unique approach to telling the story with all of these conjoining parts that it becomes so special. I guessed what was going on with these kids, at least to an extent, literally before the opening monologue of the film had ended, and yet not for 1 second in Weapons did I feel even remotely bored in spite of that. So the first section focuses on Justine, the teacher of the classroom which was suddenly empty save for one student, that being Alex, who showed up for class silent and alone. Justine, being a relatively new teacher who was the head of the class with all the disappeared students, winds up dealing with some very unfortunate harassment after the fact, which is a plot point that I actually quite enjoyed because it did a good job of illustrating the way that people will grasp at a target when something like this happens because they need something to blame. The kids went away and they don't know why or how or where they went, and all of these parents desperately need a face for all of that fear and worry and sadness about what's happened, and so Justine, being their teacher, becomes the easiest target for that, despite there being absolutely no indication that she had anything to do with them disappearing. I really enjoyed the way that the movie handled the emotions of the parents following the disappearance of their children. They do unreasonable shit, but it all feels totally believable. And even small details like Archer's son, who we watch him obviously search desperately for, turning out to be a complete asshole who bullied Alex at school, is a fun hint at the start of Alex's chapter that he had a pretty direct connection with their disappearances. Justine is played by Julia Garner, who I've been a fan of for many years now, and I'm happy to see in more roles since Ozark had one of the most flat and unearned endings to a TV show ever, and she deserved way better than that. I'm sorry. I still haven't gotten over that. God, that show was so good, and the ending was so fucking bad. As I mentioned a little earlier, many characters in this film are at various stages of addiction, with Justine seeming to be someone who's starting to tip a little further into something that could become a problem. Nothing wrong with having a nice drink to yourself at the end of a stressful day, but we see her getting drunk enough that she's unstable walking to bed. She's pouring vodka into a takeout cup, and the quantities that we see her buying are definitely something to be concerned about for someone who's planning on drinking it all to themselves. She also gets very defensive very quickly when Paul suggests that she may not be safe to drive, which to me sort of seems like she's aware of her drinking becoming something that's more prevalent, but doesn't want to accept it yet and is just automatically pushing back against the idea that it may be.
I hope you didn't drive here because...
Wait, don't be an asshole, Paul.
I'm not being...
That's not the only situation where we can feel that sort of thing. She's feeling very persecuted at the moment, being the target of a lot of really shitty stuff. And I like seeing how that manifests in other interactions where she's sort of assuming that Paul is jabbing at her with things that he's saying that are really like completely innocuous. You just really get that sense of how on edge and stressed she is at the moment with how quickly she assumes that everyone is out to get her at all times, which to a degree does have some level of truth to it at the moment. Now, Justine has all the right in the world to be stressed. The parents of her classroom are accusing her of having something to do with the disappearance of their children. She's received threatening phone calls, and her car is vandalized during the night with big red letters calling her a witch. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm having a go at her or anything. She seems to be a genuinely caring person, particularly in regards to how much she wants to help the kids in her classroom, but she does also have many boundary issues with how she goes about this.
You have a pattern in which you overstep professional lines.
Her dedicated chapter of the film closes off with that fantastic scare that I mentioned, and one small detail that I'm not even sure was intentional is that it closes off with a piece of her hair being cut off, which kind of feels like it's pointing at the way she's in the early stages of something that we see others struggle a lot with throughout the film, like it's starting to take a piece of her. Again, no idea if that was intentional or not, but I like it either way. Seems particularly relevant because she's like passed out drunk at this point. The second chapter of the film follows Archer, the father of one of the kids who's vanished, and he's played by Josh motherfucking Brolin, which is always awesome to see. Essentially what we're building up to is a climax where all of these characters who are living their own lives and trying to deal with this strange event will converge on Alex's house, and each of them provides something important for ultimately leading to that, with Archer's search for his son providing a jumping point for Justine to eventually make the connection that Alex's home is where this is likely all centered. Archer uses the security footage from people's homes to try and pinpoint if all of the kids were running to the same spot. Something I really appreciate about his character is that, as I mentioned, his son is actually like kind of an asshole, and while I don't think it's a dick move for him to have some dickish moments while trying to find his son, there are certain things that Archer does that feel like something that would be done by someone who used to be an ass when he was a kid. You kind of have a more adult version of the sort of kid that we see bullying Alex, but, you know, not to the same extent. We first meet him properly while he's sleeping in his son's bed, and the way that his wife talks to him as she's leaving for work does a lot to help illustrate that while she's trying to find her footing, Archer is probably committing nearly all of his mental energy to finding his son, which makes sense. But that one little interaction is very important for establishing where he's at in a very quick way since we don't see his wife outside of this one scene. I always like seeing when filmmakers manage to flesh out characters really well without ever sitting down and just explaining things about them to us as the audience. And while we don't get a lot in the way of direct development for Archer, little details like that help to keep him from being a shallow character. We also see him making mistakes at work, having ordered the wrong paint for the door and otherwise messing up, which they tie into that thing that I was talking about earlier with the town needing a face to direct their worry towards, when he takes the paint, which he mistakenly bought, and uses it to vandalize Justine's car. That's a really cool detail in the way that it plays with that idea by having Archer take the mistake that he made and use it in an aggressive way towards the person he's decided needs to wear the face of his missing son. I think that overall, I find Archer's chapter of the story to be the least interesting out of the bunch. That's not to say it's boring by any stretch, just a little less progressive than some of the others, with the main points of importance being having a parent of one of the kids to give us that angle of the narrative more clearly, and him being used to set up a later chapter. It's narratively important, I just don't find it as, I don't know, gripping maybe as some of the other parts. It's also cool to see Justin Long pop up once again, although it feels deeply strange to see him actually survive a horror movie. It feels unnatural. Archer's chapter of the story also brings one of the stranger moments of the movie, where during his dream sequence he follows his son into the dark night, and we see this bizarre visual of an assault rifle over the house where he goes into. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about what the specifics of this mean, especially in regards to the number 217, which is important since it's the time during the night when all the kids vanished. People have mentioned Bible verses, we have references to certain educational tragedies. I'm sorry, I have to play it safe with what I say on YouTube. And well, I think the latter is certainly something that's being touched on in the film, with all of the parents being left completely lost and confused in the wake of something that came out of absolutely nowhere. From what I can gather, it seems like the actual reasoning behind that number is much simpler than that. 17 children vanished, 2 people who were in the classroom remain, that being Alex and Justine. The assault rifle definitely seems like it's a part of some of that commentary, but I sort of just see this as a strange dream manifestation of Archer being warned that the vanished kids are being used as weapons, since there is this really cool psychological impact that the witch being in town has on the locals that I'm going to touch on in a bit. There's a lot you can pull from this, but I don't think that it's something that's essential to piecing together the film or anything like that. His chapter comes to a close with another point that shows how Cregger doesn't like to leave anything without proper purpose, as he sees Justine at a gas station, which he wouldn't have noticed had he not vandalized her car, and if he hadn't come to the gas station here, they would have never wound up in the car together to find the final piece of the puzzle where all the kids are converging. I just love that kind of thing. It's also a similarly shocking ending to Justine's chapter, where it feels like we're ramping up the intensity with each section, getting a slightly clearer look at what's going on before we pull back to find out whose eyes will be getting the next pieces of context through. During Archer's confrontation with Justine, it's interrupted by Marcus, the principal at the school where Justine works, charging full speed at them, covered in blood with his eyes bulging before attacking Justine, and that's when it ends. We'll get more context about what's going on here, of course, but for now, let's move on to talk about Paul's section of the story. This is the first time where we properly met a character in a previous chapter and are now going back to expand on what we saw from them when they appeared in someone else's story. And it's in that element where I think Paul's section of the story is the most well-crafted one before we get into Alex's at the end. What makes me love this so much is that when we first meet Paul, it's when Justine invites him out to a bar while she's having a rough night. And for that whole scene and everything else we see of him before they part ways, Paul seems like a really thoughtful, caring, level-headed dude who's certainly not without his struggles, but then we see a totally new side to him during his dedicated chapter that adds a ton of dimension to this character, and it manages to flip what we thought we knew on its head without ever feeling like we're just watching two different characters, which is really impressive. I love that scene we have of them at the bar, and there we have him talking about how his wife and him are together at the moment, so when he and Justine hook up that night, it's probably not the greatest decision for him to make, but it's not nearly as bad as what we'll find out is actually going down later on. It turns out, Paul and his wife are not separated at the moment. She's just away on a work trip. We even saw her attacking Justine at the liquor store, so we had some notion of this earlier, but here we learn that not only are they not separated, but they're apparently even trying for a baby right now, much to Paul's apparent chagrin. Now, look man, I'm gonna be totally honest and say that based on the small amount that we see from Paul's wife, I don't really blame him for not being happy in the relationship, but letting it go on like this and stringing her into thinking that they're going to have a child together while he's this clearly unhappy is just really bad. Again, this movie does a good job of setting things up without directly saying them, and Paul's wife's dad being his boss as the captain at the police station where he works sets up this feeling of them having gotten together, like maybe when they were late teens. Paul wanted to be a cop and then felt trapped even after not wanting to be with her anymore because he didn't want to jeopardize his career. Pure speculation, of course, but still a fun way to look at the dynamic that adds a good bit to it for me. Here's the thing, like I said, Paul seems like a good dude when we first meet him, but it's when we get to his chapter and get the other side of that story that we really get an idea of the kind of person he is. And it's also used to reflect the two sides of the experience of struggling with addiction, where he's sort of warmly coaxed back into drinking by just one and winds up having one hell of a night. Honestly, for a good chunk of the film, I actually wasn't entirely sure if Paul did have a serious problem with alcohol or if Donna just didn't like alcohol and forced him into a program despite him not truly needing it, because the way that he behaves around it doesn't immediately feel like someone who really struggled with alcohol, but that's exactly why it's such an effective exploration of this sort of thing. Someone can seem absolutely fine after going through programs and getting sober and whatnot, and it's when they get sort of aloof about it that they can tend to fall back into problems. And the thing that really sells for me that he probably did have a genuine problem with it is how he looks when he comes home after his night with Justine. This is pretty clearly meant to reflect someone who's just fallen back into something that they know is a serious issue for them. That look on his face, the exasperation, the way he's dressed, this is enough confirmation for me. It's a really interesting moment too, since Donna has come home before Paul was expecting her to, and her initial reaction to seeing him and realizing what's happened is one that on its face seems extremely unsupportive and shitty of someone who's in a situation like that, because this is only a vignette of a brief point in their lives. We have no actual way of knowing if she's completely justified in this reaction due to their history. Her going at Justine in the liquor store is a wild moment, but I mean, man, we can't really judge someone entirely off a couple minutes of screen time. So this plot point leaves so much to be wondered about in terms of not only their relationship, but Paul's character and how his entirety could conflict with the mostly level version that we see for much of the movie. What furthers that feeling is how we see him behave when it comes to him doing something pretty goddamn bad while he's out on patrol, where he comes across James attempting to break into a building and detains him, searches him, and finds that James was dishonest about having anything in his pockets, which led to Paul getting a used needle in his finger, and he just immediately knocks James out. Already not good, but then his first reaction before ensuring that James is alright is to focus on his own safety, which I don't think is entirely unreasonable from a human standpoint of panicking after something like that, but him unplugging the dash cam and then doing everything he can to cover up paints a pretty clear picture of the kind of dude he can be. It makes us question if the kind person that we saw at the bar is an honest reflection of him, or if that was him covering up the true self that Donna was reacting to. There's so much going on in Paul's chapter, and he's an extremely dimensional and well fleshed out character that presents a fascinating exploration of a really tricky stage of addiction, where someone claims to be completely in the clear and not being in need of help anymore. It's also completely still possible that Donna is just being unsupportive and shitty here, but they leave so much for us to think about, and we won't really ever know one way or another for sure. It's not a helpful reaction, but we don't know the context, and it could be justified to an extent, or it could just be her being really unsupportive and unhelpful. It's an especially potent reflection of alcohol abuse when looked at through the lens of Justine embodying his drinking in a way, since she seems to be in denial of her budding dependence and insists that, she's alright to drive, which is reflective of the deceptive nature that substances can have when people who struggle with them face them down. Now, I'm fine to drive, you can have one drink, it's perfectly alright. But when we see how he looks back home, it's hard to see that this was as harmless of an experience as it initially looked to be. Also, when you look at it through the lens of her being someone who he went to a bar to see while working through sobriety, who seduces him, leading him to cheating on his wife, and then going at him the next morning about the missing kids like no one's doing any work, despite her having absolutely no information about how much work they're really doing, that can absolutely be seen as an analog for alcohol, which lulls him in, leads him down a bad road, and then the next morning she's pretty much a hangover in a sense. A quick word about that scene with James, because it's such a well-crafted moment that's made much more satisfying in the way that it all comes together once we get to his chapter of the film. Really, the main thing I wanted to talk about here is how well the scene captures the panic that Paul feels when that needle enters his finger. Starting with the unease with the fact that James's response to his questioning about having anything in his pockets makes it seem like he's definitely been in cuffs before and is sort of just robotically saying what he expects is the correct answer for any given situation, regardless of whether it's actually correct.
Anything in your pocket's gonna stick me when I put my hands in there, James.
No, sir, I do not.
I don't even think he did this on purpose. I just think that James is kind of airheaded. He either thought he could get away with it or just really wasn't paying attention to what Paul was asking him, and that leads into the moment of panic so well as Paul tries to clean out the wound and then falls into an even further panic when he realizes what he's just captured on his dash cam. It's just a really rapidly intensifying scene that gets used in an interesting way later on, which ties into Paul warning James that if he sees him around then he'll arrest him, letting him off for now, but leaving this warning out of fear that James will report what happened and that then the dash cam footage will be discovered, causing Paul to more than likely lose his job, which is absolutely warranted in a situation like this. This section closes off with Paul seeing James coming towards the police station and chasing him down, which is something that gets flipped on its head in a really cool way in just a bit. Paul's chapter of the film is the one that I find to be the most layered and complex, and it adds so much, but it's time to move on to James's chapter. This is the first time that we're following a character who isn't directly involved with the children who disappeared, so as soon as he comes on screen, we have this sense of a story that already feels quite hard to put your finger on, pulling any balance you may have established by this point, which is a lot of fun. James is played by Austin Abrams, who I've talked about back in that Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark video, but this dude is just great. It's awesome to see him getting more roles because he's quite the versatile actor, and this is probably my favorite work that I've seen from him so far. James is a young man who's really struggling to find his way in life, living in tents in the woods and dealing with some pretty severe addiction, with him being on that far end of the spectrum we've seen displayed by various characters. We've also seen him a couple of times already, of course in Paul's section of the film, but also for a brief moment earlier on in Justine's chapter when she's going to the liquor store and he's outside trying to collect money under the guise that he's trying to go see his brother and needs bus fare. Just a nice tie-in that makes the world feel more fleshed out and connected. It's here where we get the most significant development with the missing kids, and it's really helping to make that sense of getting a little more information each time feel well-earned and satisfying. James is a really fun character. I like how this movie can take someone like him who spends his days robbing people to try and resell whatever he finds and make him most people's favorite character in the whole thing. Yeah, it's shitty to see him as this opportunistic thief, especially when he steals what's clearly a child's toy, but there's a really charming and sympathetic side to him. Austin Abrams is without a doubt a massive part of this, bringing a fantastic humor to the dude that makes him endlessly entertaining to watch, despite what he's doing being pretty objectively awful. He's more dimensional than just the homeless drug addict archetype. You get this feeling that he never had the proper guidance to help him learn how to get on his own feet. And he's just trying to make do in the only way that he can see, trying to get money in absolutely any way that presents itself to him. One thing that I really loved about how James was written that helps emphasize that this dude is just, he's not got the most solid mental foundation, we'll put it, is that his excuses that he makes up either for why he needs to borrow money from someone or an excuse made for getting out of a sticky situation are all absolutely terrible. Paul literally watched him trying to pry his way into a building through an alleyway and then immediately says that he works there and just forgot his keys. What was his plan if Paul did call the building? Was he going to say he technically worked there but just didn't have the clothes he needed yet, so he actually needed to borrow some money from Paul right quick so he can buy the clothes he needs to get the job that he already has, apparently?
Hey man, I feel like I wasn't communicating very well. How important it is that I get just a little bit of money so that I can get the clothes for the job so that I can get the job, obviously.
Oh. I really like this dude. He's entertaining and very sympathetic, and he's got some of the most quotable lines of the whole movie, particularly when he's on the phone trying to report that he's found the missing kids, but knows that he needs to stay away from the police station because of Paul.
I really don't like police stations, they just kind of freak me out. I'm phobic.
He winds up getting more involved in the story through a robbery he commits after that run-in with Paul, where he just so happens across Alex's home and gives us our first proper look at how bad shit has gotten in there. Alex's parents are these eerie, frozen statues on the couch, and the house feels utterly abandoned, having a somewhat similar atmosphere to what you'd expect from some frozen-over site discovered in the Arctic, which is really cool. The movie is inching nearer to when it gets really dark for a while, and I love how that tone sort of slowly bleeds in through the runtime, which makes that ultimate freeze-over of the atmosphere all the more satisfying when we get there. The thing that I love the most about this scene is right when Alex's parents suddenly start going at James to chase him out of the house, and there's this really great shot where the camera is basically from the angle of the door, and when James swings it, we get this super startling shot of them walking towards him in such an unnatural way, and then once again, the movie messes with what we're expecting since they just shut the door when he leaves. Well, in the house, James saw the kids in the basement, and while he's trying to pawn off stuff he stole from Alex's house, he sees a poster offering a $50,000 reward and realizes the position that he's in. It's there when he goes to the police station, hoping to claim the reward, and gets chased off by Paul, where we get this fantastic moment where he sees Glattis in the woods, and this is something I need to gush about for a second. Weapons has a rather unique tone to it, but the look and feel of the movie is pretty cold and subdued for the most part, with blue, gray, and dark green tones being the primary palette that we're working with. That feels appropriate for the story that we have here. But this moment introducing Glattis is such a fantastic way to throw us off what we've gotten accustomed to up to this point, with her bright orange hair and pink makeup sticking out like a sore thumb in the woods. I also love it because there are many stories of people wandering through the woods and coming across a witch doing some weird shit, and this primarily reminds me of the Benigne, a spirit in Scottish folklore who would be seen washing the clothes of people whose deaths were imminent, acting as an omen of their impending fate. Now, she's not washing clothes or anything here, but just seeing her slouched over in the woods like this gives me a similar feeling to what I had reading about these things when I was a kid. Another thing that I love about this is how, while the things that have happened in the movie could be pretty wild, outside of actual dream sequences, the film has a very naturalistic presentation, and this here is where Glattis's impact on the mental state of people can be seen very clearly, with the sequence taking on a super dreamy feel, with her waving being eerily slow, the soundscape altering, and just the plain strangeness of the visual of Glattis there helping to sell this moment. You also get a fun bit of James hiding in a tent thinking that Glattis is coming after him and charging out with 3 syringes, stabbing who turns out to be Paul in the face with them. I just really enjoy the gag of this whole thing escalating to this point because James, failed to mention that he had a needle in his pocket and Paul absolutely lost his mind over it, and now he's getting 3 straight to the face. This chapter of the film comes to a close with James leading Paul to the house, hoping that he can still claim the reward, but Paul doesn't come back out until the dead of night, where he drags James outside, now clearly under the influence of whatever had taken over Alex's parents. And that leads us into the penultimate chapter of the film, this time around focusing on Marcus, the principal at Justine's school. This is largely used as a way to help explain some of what we've seen up to this point and transition into Alex's chapter, but it's also where the movie shows that while it's had lots of humor in it and hasn't treated its horror in a fully dark way yet, it's not afraid to do so, and it makes it so much worse because in the short time that we spend with Marcus and Terry, it is impossible not to love these dudes. A lot of the time in movies where we have someone like Justine who's getting, badly treated in the public eye, their boss is often an antagonistic character in the story who's not being supportive of them. But Marcus is the polar opposite of this. He's a super reasonable dude who understands that Justine is having a really hard time and does his best to keep the parents at bay and calm any heated situation he's able to. But he's also not a pushover and is entirely willing to draw hard boundaries and stick to them. He just seems like a very mature and calm person, which is part of why I think it was such a great idea to have him be the one who attacks Justine at the gas station, since it makes it so much more shocking and bizarre to see, and the relationship between him and Terry is set up in such a sweet way. Essentially, how we spend our time with them is simply through them going through what seems like everyday motions of a very content life, picking up some groceries and then settling down with a meal fit for kings and watching TV together in the afternoon. It's subtle, but there's such a warm and homely vibe to this short chapter of the film. It's also where we properly meet Glattis for the first time, in a scene that is equal parts off-putting and hilarious. Thank you, Amy Madigan. I'm gonna gush about you in a bit. Glattis shows up at Marcus's house claiming to have missed a bus and wondering if she can get some water. And man, there are a few moments I can think of in the last few years where a whole theater I've been in was laughing as much as they were with this line.
Get her a glass.
A bowl, please. Yes, a bowl. It's a peculiarity of mine. I don't even try to rationalize it anymore.
It's so well delivered and comes out of fucking nowhere. We finally get a taste of what's been going on with Justine getting her hair cut and Glattis eyeing some stuff in Marcus's office and things like that when she reveals that she took something from him and uses it as a part of a ritual to force him into killing Terry, which just sucks. They seem like they had such a chill life, man. While the scene has that sense of humor to it, it's also pretty damn dark and captures a really solid sense of panic from these two as they watch Glattis perform this ritual in their kitchen. And once Marcus is done with Terry, Glattis sends him off to go get Justine, which is how we tie into what happened earlier on. This sequence of him running through town while people react to this insane sight is also hilarious. Like with the what the fuck after Archer woke up from that dream earlier on, this scene helps to illustrate further how this movie balances the absurd things that are going on by having the people who witness these events react in ways that feel appropriate. Terry's murder is made even more shocking since it's pretty damn violent, and up to this point, there hasn't really been anything all that graphic, so it's like a bit of a slap in the face. It's here where Weapons went from being a movie that I was really enjoying to what's maybe my favorite horror film of 2025. I think I put Bring Her Back higher when I ranked them, but I don't know. I think that was a mood thing when I was working on the script. They're probably tied. Where to even begin with this? First of all, Alex's dad is hilarious. He's played by Whitmer Thomas, who gives this wonderfully awkward performance that feels like a dude who was born to be a dad. I mean, look at the dad drip. It's perfect. I could have done with 37 additional scenes of this dude interacting with Alex just because of how weird and entertaining his character is.
Kiss any supermodels?
No.
All right.
They did a fantastic job of setting up this young family with a warm household, his parents seeming very sweet and well realized, the house having a nice soft tone to it, which Cregger is of course using as a setup for the contrast once Glattis comes around. They wind up needing to take in Aunt Glattis, and this is where the film fully realizes its themes that it's been touching on the whole time. Weapons was largely inspired by Cregger's experience of dealing with alcoholism in his own family along with his own struggles. And Glattis is essentially used as a stand-in not only for the addiction from a personal standpoint, but in terms of Alex's character, an exploration of how these struggles impact family dynamics and, the sort of reversal of the care role that children can land in when their parents are struggling with something like this. Before looking into how the film was written, I did sort of read this from the angle that Cregger was thinking about, but I initially took it as a reflection of how age and health issues impact the care roles as opposed to alcoholism, and that's something that can definitely be applied to this. One of the things that I think makes this such a satisfying movie to engage with is because it doesn't bind itself directly to using alcoholism here. Alex's parents, at least from what we see, don't have that problem, and so you can take this dynamic and look at it through any struggle that causes kids to take on the carer role, and it works perfectly. The movie likes to push on the idea of addiction as a parasite throughout its runtime, with little bits like the TV show that Marcus and Terry are watching, talking about the cordyceps fungus, or Justine talking about parasites in class when we first pick up with Alex. I think that's a really interesting way to look at these sorts of struggles, and having Glattis enter the story as this foreign entity showing up one day and flipping everything on its head is just a fantastic way of playing with this idea. Essentially what's going on here is that Glattis is dying. Of what? We don't entirely know. Apparently, Cregger gave Amy Madigan 2 ideas for what could be wrong with her, and then told her to pick one and never tell him what it is. So not even he knew for sure what was going on with her while he was making the movie. What matters is that she came to Alex's house in the hopes that she could feed off of the life force of his parents, taking it for herself and coming back to health. And when that didn't work, she asked Alex to bring an item from each of his classmates to her so that she could summon them from the house and feed off of them as well, which is what caused that strange running off in the middle of the night. When Glattis first gets there, we get this moment where Alex peers through the door and sees her sick in bed, barely able to move and looking absolutely haggard, which sets up a really eerie moment when he gets home from school to find his parents in this trance-like state, and we see Glattis up and moving with an energy level that simply doesn't make sense to see from someone who looked like this only very recently. It's during this period where Weapons fully commits itself to horror in a way that it hasn't done yet, with everything taking a very dark tone, with the visual change along with the music that I mentioned earlier on, which is so ominous and haunting and fits perfectly. The sequence of Glattis demonstrating the state that she's placed Alex's parents in is, at least in my opinion, the most effectively unsettling moment of the film for a number of reasons. One is just because it's so much darker and more bleak than anything we've seen up to this point, and because the movie hasn't given us a chance to acquaint ourselves with anything truly disturbing yet, it's like a cold splash of water to the face. Glattis getting Alex's parents to stab themselves in the face with their forks is undoubtedly a disturbing moment that always gets a solid reaction, but the thing that really makes this section so harrowing is how realistically helpless Alex is. A lot of people have trouble writing kids effectively, so it's always really great when you can watch a movie and actually feel like a kid character is a kid instead of an adult who's forgotten what children are actually like. I love how during this whole scene, he's entirely unwilling to focus on anything that Glattis is saying and is just zeroed in on his parents, which is exactly what a kid his age would be doing here. It's so sad to watch him helplessly calling for his parents to break out of whatever this is. I also think it's cool to see a line that I feel like in and of itself isn't all that interesting or unique, but here it feels so earned because of how they've built this up and established this awful situation, and it makes what could have been a forgettable line one of the most chilling of the whole movie.
I can make them eat each other if I want to.
Alex's isolation is something that goes beyond him being trapped in here. The power is shut off, leaving the house dark and cold. The windows are covered in newspaper. It's such a bleak and sad way of playing with what's going on here, especially when you take into account why Cregger decided to go this route. It's a really sad thing that kids do wind up needing to take on these sorts of roles for their parents and are left in such a cold place, all alone with nothing but the shells of who were meant to raise them and the awful parasites standing in the middle. I especially like how this reflects the themes of alcoholism, since drinking, at least for some people, leads to a really bad temper, and so having his parents be comatose but using Glattis as a threat of retaliation that could come if Alex were to even step even somewhat out of line is a really great touch. Because Glattis is feeding off of their very essence in order to keep herself going, they're left in this trance state, leaving Alex to need to feed them and care for them through the day as they just sit around waiting for whatever Glattis's rituals tell them to do. Alex isn't only a believable kid, he's also one of the smartest kid characters you'll find in horror, playing along well in the ways that will keep Glattis at bay, but not hesitating to take advantage of something when he sees the opportunity to finally get back at her. He's a really great character because he's so young and vulnerable. It adds a whole extra layer of disturbing quality onto his chapter. You grow to care about him so quickly and want him to get out and go back to the way things were, but Glattis is such an unrelenting and unforgiving presence, especially in the face of a child, that it makes that helpless feeling all the more realistic and unsettling. As for Glattis herself, man, I may have figured that this was going to be a witch from the opening scene of the movie, but I certainly wasn't expecting something like this, and that's one of my favorite feelings in the world. Amy Madigan has rightfully gotten a ton of praise for her performance in this film. Like I said, she just recently won an Oscar. She really encapsulates the entirety of the film with an absolutely absurd look and some of the funniest moments of the runtime, and then being able to switch on a dime and become genuinely horrifying when the moment calls for it. We don't get much information about Glattis. Cregger had apparently written an entire chapter dedicated to her, but wound up cutting it because he wanted to maintain some of the allure around her character. And I think that was the right decision. Granted, he's already confirmed that they're making a dedicated film just about Glattis's backstory, so that mystery isn't going to be left entirely intact, but at least for the time being, we don't know much about her, and I I'm fine with that. I enjoy that. The reason that I'm glad he at least decided to tell the story in a separate film is because of how good of a job he did at making her feel like she has a ton of backstory connected to her without us ever actually learning any of it, largely through the way that they go about lighting certain scenes and how the music alters during those moments. My favorite of these is in the middle of the night when she calls to Alex after realizing that his parents aren't enough to sustain her, and he comes in to find her kneeled over in this dirty gown looking extremely withered. What makes this whole thing for me, and I'm feeling it like bubbling up inside of me just talking about it, is how unique this room feels compared to the rest of the house, which is cold and blue. Whereas in here, it feels like we're being transported to an entirely different place, thanks to how she's cleared the space out, placed her tree that she grows the bewitching branches on, and has candles laid around for similarly ritualistic purposes, if I were to guess. It's like we've somehow wandered into a witch's shack in the middle of the dark forest. It's a super distinct feel compared to most of the movie, and saving this sort of visual aesthetic for only these moments with Glattis adds so much history to this character. Her rituals are also super cool to watch and have a similar effect, and I just love how these sprinkles of a witch who feels like she's been around for a very long time adds this deep level of background to a character who we don't get much concrete information on. I'm really interested in her being Alex's mom's aunt. Yeah, and how that plays into all of this, and I suppose we'll get the answer to that sometime, but for now, I'm really enjoying the mystery. One more thing that I wanted to mention that I really love about this film is how Glattis's presence in this town is toyed with to create this sense of her strange magic permeating through the air before we ever meet her. I'd say before we ever see her, but she can actually be seen during that opening monologue. These touches of her presence bleeding into people's dreams or her makeup appearing on Alex's face during Justine's dream is just such a cool way to create a mysterious atmosphere around this character. I love that sort of like unexplained energy in movies where there's something happening beneath the surface, and it's really well handled through this kind of thing. It gives this all-encompassing feeling to Glattis that emphasizes that magic of her character. I love it. I suppose that'll about bring us to the end of the film, which plays out when Justine and Archer finally find some common ground when he realizes that there's more going on here than he knows, and she helps him pinpoint that the kids seem to have been converging in the direction of Alex's house. They get there and an insane fight ensues when they make the mistake of stepping over Glattis's salt lines, which brings about this great sequence of the possessed James continuously charging at Archer between getting knocked out repeatedly, Justine peeling Paul's face with a potato peeler, holy evil dead, and Archer getting hit with one banger of a jump scare in the basement while searching through the crowd of kids for his own son. Can I mention too, by the way, I understand that jump scares are corny, but every time I talk about good jump scares, I get comments saying there's no good jump scares. Bullshit. Complete bullshit. You can do a good jump scare. There are amazing jump scares. They've just been used lazily a lot, so now we associate them with that. But this is great. It's here where everything is just coming together in such a satisfying crescendo, and the ending of the film is a really interesting one from an emotional standpoint. First, we have the rewarding feeling of all of these separate stories finally coming together for the final act, all under the power of Glattis's curses. Then we have the extreme catharsis of Alex finally fighting back and taking control of the situation, as Glattis has just told him that they'll be leaving town the following day as it's getting too hot here. And because he's able to get into Glattis's room while she's distracted downstairs and has watched her do these rituals, he's able to do one that will turn everything back against her. It's just so powerful to see this young, innocent kid, or previously innocent kid, taking back power from the thing that stole everything from him and use it against the thing as his parents are trying to kill him on the other side of the door, it's just so emotionally rich. Now that leads us into the bittersweet conclusion. Cregger didn't want to leave us just feeling bleak as we walked into the theater, and so before we get that ending, he treats us to what I'd consider one of the most entertaining chase sequences I've ever seen. To be clear, not generally a fan of chase sequences myself. There are a few that are great, but I find they're often just kind of boring padding. In this case, however, it's not only extremely satisfying to see Glattis realize that Alex has used a ritual against her and has turned all of her weapons into heat-seeking missiles pointed directly her way, it's also just a really funny sequence. Cregger's sort of slapstick humor is on full display here, and it's a really heartwarming experience to watch this deeply evil person that we've seen ruin an innocent child's life and the lives of so many others run in terror at what's coming, while also getting to laugh at the various scenarios we watch her run through. Super good stuff. And it leads into the wonderful catharsis of her getting absolutely torn to shreds in the front lawn by all the kids. The movie isn't overly graphic, but this is gory as all hell. And it makes it all the more enjoyable that they've saved the most violent scene of the movie for the perpetrator of all this suffering. The film comes to a close on a rather unexpected note, where yes, the kids are no longer under Glattis' influence and Alex is taken to a better home, but we learn that none of the people who were cursed have returned to the way they were. Alex's parents still require full-time care and went off to a facility, and the state of the kids remains so poor that it's noteworthy, apparently, to mention that some of them have begun speaking again, which we learn in a closing narration to wrap up the film. That's an ending that's just like, oh, shit. And it makes sense, considering the gravity of what happened and the themes being explored. I love that sort of open ending where it's left up in the air whether or not anyone will ever fully recover. But what makes it even better is how Cregger wanted to make that ending more palatable by having that really fun and cathartic chase sequence leading up to Glattis' death. It allows the movie to have a rather serious ending without leaving the viewer on a pure downer note. Perfect example of having our cake and eating it too, and it only helps to further exemplify why I say that Weapons is a movie that can be fully enjoyed whether you're looking for something that's a serious exploration of a tricky topic with some great horror in it, or if you just want to have some fun with a wild, twisting, and entertaining scary movie. Weapons is brilliant. It's really the only way I can put it. It's an endlessly enjoyable film that I feel like perfectly balanced thematic exploration with entertainment. It's got a ton of rewatch value, despite the mystery not being anything overly complex because of how well it focuses on making these stories come together and be enjoyed entirely on their own without feeling separate from the overall narrative, and the technical aspects are handled with so much precision. I love this movie. I'm sorry this video took me a while to finish. For whatever reason, I thought this would be like a 30-minute chat at max, but then it just snowballed and I couldn't stop. And then all the, copyright stuff came out. So it's taken me a long while to figure out how to do this video, but I'm really glad I got to do it. I actually haven't watched the movie since writing this video. And now sitting here and talking about it, I'm like, oh my God, I forgot how good this movie is. I want to watch Weapons again. It's so I love you. I know I said Bring Her Back was my favorite horror movie of 2025. I think Weapons and Bring Her Back are just tied. I love you, Weapons. Thank you for being you. I fucking love this movie, man. God damn, it's so good. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.